From early uses as temporary wartime housing to becoming modern, high-quality homes, manufactured housing has evolved immensely. With changing perceptions and innovative financing via Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, manufactured homes are a viable solution in today's housing needs. We discuss this and more with guest Chris Nicely, a veteran in factory-built housing.
We as a country have made it very difficult for people wanting their first home and maybe the first generation to own their own home. The dream is there and the demand is there and the household income in many cases is there, but we're not embracing a form of housing that could deliver well-built, quality, appreciating asset for the home buyer. And as a result, those families are ending up in rental situations. I think we're going to see a lesser and lesser emphasis on the way a home is built and more emphasis on the delivery and the end product and home ownership.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the Construction Lending Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Ferris with Land Gorilla, and today I would like to welcome Chris Nicely, president of ManufacturedHomes.com. Chris is a seasoned professional with nearly 30 years in factory-built housing. He's led ManufacturedHomes.com and ModularHomes.com. Chris has contributed to Harvard studies on affordable housing as well as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. He has overseen 80 communities while working for Clayton Homes. He holds degrees in economics and an MBA. Chris is also a Harvard graduate in community development and has committed his career to positive changes in the housing sector. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. But as we get started, why don't you first tell me a little bit about ManufacturedHomes.com and what you're doing?
Well, I appreciate it. And thanks for having me in the podcast. And really, factory-built housing in general, and specifically manufactured homes, are widely misunderstood. And over the last 20, 25 years, certainly the 30 years I've been involved in factory-built housing in one way or another, there's been so many innovative changes in the product itself, the components, the design, the appearance, and it really represents a viable option for housing that we haven't embraced fully in this country, and it does represent one of the options for attainable housing for many families that can't afford other options in the marketplace right now. So it is truly one of the areas that we need to better understand and utilize when it makes more sense to go factory built than it does site built.
Well, why aren't we building more manufactured or modular homes today? If that's the solution, and hey, we've got this affordability crisis out there, why is that not just widely adopted and we're building like crazy?
Yeah, I think part of it is old habits are hard to break, especially when they're successful and especially when the market is receiving it. So there's been a gradual over the last, since the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, there's been a gradual, maybe not so gradual, but a focus on the higher end, and as a result, higher end homes, and as a result, lower cost homes, lower priced homes in that middle section, that what we call the missing middle, has been, I wouldn't say ignored, but the attention on it has lessened considerably to where we're doing half as many attainable homes in that sector of 80 to 100% AMI than we used to prior to the recession. So it's that situation that really has exacerbated the lack of use of manufactured modular housing by housing development professionals. And I think that's changing a little bit and slowly, but really it's been, why change it if it isn't broken? And that's the concept that many developers and builders and others have right now of the site built versus factory built housing.
So it sounds like, builders and developers are out chasing after the profitability that they can get building a much bigger home rather than focusing on, high volume or, entry level housing. Is that
That's what the data would suggest. Yeah, that's what the data would suggest.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the size of the homes and the price points of the homes that are being built and sold, this is all in new construction.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what's happened, and it's very different than what was happening in the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been attention towards larger homes, larger price points, McMansions as you were, but the new buyer is not so attentive to square footage as it is functionality of the product and the pricing of the product, and that's what's causing some additional attention to factory built housing because of what you can get for the price delivered. So it is changing, but it's changing very slowly.
Okay. Well, what else seems to be getting in the way of, manufactured or factory built housing being the go-to solution for affordability? You mentioned that, hey, we're building a lot more McMansions, and when I think of kind of that McMansion concept of the homes over 2,500 square feet, I don't think of those as first-time home buyers, but I think somebody maybe getting into a factory built house could be a great first-time home buyer. So I almost kind of segment the two, and affordability seems to be like around that first-time home buyer. I mean, I'm just kind of throwing that out there. Does that seem about?
Yeah, I mean, we made it very difficult. We as a country have made it very difficult for people wanting their first home and maybe the first generation to own their own home. And as a result, we have more and more people and a demand for rental properties or a great demand for a limited supply of older homes that have every intention. The buyer has every intention of refurbing when they come in, but because of the cost of refurbing, a lot of the refurb never happens and they end up living in substandard housing at some point or eventually. But it's really, Sean, it's really about understanding what the product can deliver and how the product has changed over the last 20 years and how the value and quality and appreciation and lifespan of manufactured housing, all of those are very, very similar to site built. So understanding the product, breaking the stereotype, looking at it, the components, the design, is it what you need for your family? Is it at a price point that you can afford within the income that your household generates? So it's starting to slowly come around to that and recognize factory built housing. But at the same time, recent statistic that I read is there's where it used to be close to 40% of the new construction was less than 2,000 square feet. It's now down to 20%. So the supply of affordable housing or reasonably affordable housing has been cut in half, and that hurts us long term. But the exciting part of this, in my opinion, is recent survey by Fortune magazine talked about the millennials, huge marketplace, over 80 million, bigger than the boomer market ever was. It talks about the millennials, and 97% of them still have that dream of home ownership. So the dream is there, and the demand is there, and the household income in many cases is there, but we're not embracing a form of housing that could deliver well-built, quality, appreciating asset for the home buyer. And as a result, those families are ending up in rental situations. So instead of a ownership situation where they can appreciate, um, they can participate in the wealth appreciation and those type of things. So it's about misunderstanding. It's about stigma, stereotypes from the past that continue today, but that is slowly changing.
You mentioned the past there, and me and you had a really great conversation where we kind of talked about the history of factory built housing. Where it came from. What's kind of gotten in the way, some of the challenges over time. I found that absolutely fascinating. Just kind of why don't you give our listeners a little brief history, on some of the challenges and where manufactured housing even came from.
Yeah, factory-built housing has been around well over 100 years, and you could even take it back further than that if you wanted to. But certainly, in the form that we know it today, it's over 100 years old. And back prior to World War II, it was really for workforce housing and for what we would call today glamping, and where people would load their household items into a truck or a trailer and take it on a trip or vacation and camp out of that vehicle. And that was pretty much it. My grandfather, his brothers were general contractors, and back in the 20s and 30s, they were in West Virginia, and they would go to New York or Boston or Chicago or Cleveland when there was a construction effort, and they would take all of their needed supplies and household items with them in a truck, and many times live out of that truck or a house trailer during that construction process. The alternative was a rooming house or a boarding house in those days for a dime or a quarter a night until the project was finished. So that was the genesis of today's manufactured housing and the words trailer and things like that. Then in World War II, a lot of the younger generation came out of the agricultural sector, went into the military, went to war, and Ford and GM and others still had that demand for labor to build equipment for our troops in Europe and Pacific theaters. And as a result, what they did was buy land and develop these camps, and very much similar to an Airstream trailer today,
Mhm.
they would populate these parks, trailer parks, as they became known as, for the labor that was working in those factories for producing equipment for our troops. Then after the war, GIs came back. They didn't want to go back into the agricultural sector, many of them, and they wanted to stay in a urban environment, and populated these trailer parks back in the 40s and 50s, and they became their primary homes. And from there, we saw the product begin to evolve from a camping trailer, a recreational vehicle, to a permanent housing structure up until the 70s, when at one point in the 70s, the industry was producing 300,000 housing units a year back in the mid 70s. And then HUD came out with a standard, said, hey, these are now homes. And in 74, and then the big HUD standards were issued in 76 that changed the way manufactured homes were described, and also a federal code that manufactured homes were built to. And from there, it began to elevate and progress and innovate, quite frankly, throughout the next 50 years. And that's where we find ourselves today, with a product that is built in the manufacturing in the manufactured housing sector built to the federal HUD code and inspected by an independent third-party inspector before it ever leaves the plant and tagged as meeting all those HUD code standards. And that's what today's manufactured housing is. And when you add the design changes and component changes and those type of things, and the high quality Urban Institute doing a study and talking about appreciation. It appreciates, these homes appreciate at the same or similar rate as site-built housing and others. So a lot of study has come out to support the quality argument and the change in perception of manufactured housing. And you just need to understand what it is and what you want for whatever project you're working on. And manufactured housing, factory built housing in general, most likely will have that product to answer the needs and fill the objectives. So that's kind of where we are.
Absolutely love that story. And it seems like, hey, in the 70s that we get some standardization and labels start applying, right? Like, hey, it's got to be built to this HUD code. Yep. And this is the name it's going to have, and we want to be able to track it for whatever, safety or regulatory reasons. And it kind of splinters off. And from there, now that there's a label to it, now it's separated, financing is going to be, this way, and financing for stick-built home is going to be this way. And we start talking about some of you've mentioned it a couple times now, some of the stigma that comes along with it. Now that we have names, that those stigmas start to carry through time. How has that, because I think we both agree the stigma is probably one of the things that gets in the way of people, just mentally thinking, oh, I don't want to live in a manufactured home. I've seen movies of how they portray, that lifestyle. I don't want to be that person.
Yep.
How do we, and which is not the case. I mean, you look at some of these homes and you can't distinguish the difference between them and the quality. I mean, you could drive some of these things on a freeway at 70 miles an hour and, not batter an eye. It holds up better than a stick-built home as far as, the durability and quality and energy efficiency. It's all there today.
Yep.
Why is that even continuing, that stigma today? Is this a marketing issue? Is this a Hollywood issue?
Yes to all of that. Yes to all of that. It is like the houses behind me. It is a misunderstood production method for housing. Mm-hmm. And it's because of the stigma we have associated with manufactured housing over decades of experience since after the World War II. So it's the continuation of the stigma initially because it was competitive with site built, and then later because it was considered to attract a resident or an owner that was deemed to be less than other homeowners in a marketplace. So part of it was class related, part of it was race related, part of it was structure related and image related. A lot of it was Hollywood stigma. A lot of it was marketing. A lot of it was competitive play in exclusionary zoning and some things like that, so that manufactured housing would be the lesser of two choices when deciding between site built versus factory built. That is slowly changing, not because there's less competition, it's because the crisis in need. And we have anywhere between, depending on who you want to listen to, 3 to 5 million housing units that are needed to house this next generation of home buyers, which is the millennials, and late to the late to the party in household formation, but they're there now. They're having children. They want a place to live. They want a place of their own. They want to have an appreciating asset that they can build their family wealth and all of those associated with it. At the same time, the supply is short, as we talked about before. The supply is short, and therefore the demand, the supply and demand curves. You have low supply, high demand, high cost, higher costs, especially with supply chain issues for the most part, which have been mitigated recently, that occurred in the COVID situation, that drove up the costs for housing, even in factory built housing. So it's that kind of situation, and the change in perception, and what the challenge to the industry today is aggressively going after this stigma and stereotype and demonstrating what the product is today and what it can deliver. The open floor plans, the island kitchens, the beautiful master and main bedroom, bathroom situations. The amenities that site builders have been putting into their homes are now quite literally standard in manufactured housing of any kind. So it's that situation. The stigma stereotype is perpetuated because of a lot of issues surrounding fear and protectionism and that type of thing. And we're slowly making inroads, but we as an industry are helping to educate the general population, especially lenders, appraisers, developers, and others, and municipalities for sure. But it really relies on the demand, the crisis level demand in the marketplace for housing that's not being met right now. So it is a challenge, and something that changing the paradigm, shifting that paradigm, is tough in any situation, and certainly it is in housing as well.
You mentioned a study by the Urban Institute around appreciation.
Yeah.
And I think to your comments was, hey, right at about the same rate or near the same rate of stick-built housing, you have, manufactured housing following really closely behind that.
Yep.
And I'm curious, because I'd say that there's probably a stigma there too that needs to be, addressed, is the appreciation. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that study and how it's been impactful?
Yeah, the distribution model in manufactured housing, especially, not so much in modular, but manufactured housing, emulates the car industry. So there's a producer of the product, and then there's distributors of the product. In the car situation, they call them dealers. In the manufactured housing industry, they're called retailers. And the retailers then assume that role of interfacing with the consumer. And it's because of that association, or that very similar distribution model, manufactured housing is having, when compared to automotive, that a lot of the automotive stereotypes are transferred to the manufactured housing stereotypes. And one of the biggest stereotypes in automotive is the moment you drive the car off the lot, it depreciates 20-30%. And it continues to go downhill for years after that, especially as mileage be put on it. Similar thought, similar philosophy also branded manufactured housing. And it was always thought of as a depreciating asset similar to automotive. Well, that may have been true in the 50s and 60s. It's no longer true because of the quality of the house, the value of the home to the home buyer. and the innovation that's been going, including energy, including components, design, all of those kind of things, that elevates that product to its counterparts in the marketplace. And as a result, it is no longer anywhere close to that automotive distribution model and automotive value model. It is much more aligned with the traditional site-built housing model that yields appreciation, and that's what the Urban Institute reported on, yields appreciation on new construction and ownership of that product when it's properly done, when it's properly maintained, when it's sited properly. And all of those things, the Urban Institute says, yeah, you have this option, and guess what? It builds family wealth at a very similar rate as site-built housing. And so that was the two stigma stereotypes that are associated with manufactured housing is it doesn't last very long and it doesn't appreciate. Well, number one, University of Georgia did a study. The home life of a manufactured home is every bit as much as a site-built home, and sometimes better. You alluded to the fact that every house is wind tested at least at 70 miles an hour going down the freeway being delivered. Site-built house would fly apart, and manufactured housing has to stay together and intact. And the second thing is it is a depreciation asset, and the Urban Institute proved that as a fallacy. And so we have a product that can yield high quality housing security for a family through factory built housing production, innovation, and techniques that will deliver a house at a lower cost point for a developer, ultimately for a buyer, now being financed through traditional programs with Fannie and Freddie called Choice Homes with Freddie and MH Advantage with Fannie that mirrors a site-built mortgage at 30 years and lower interest rates and those kind of things. So it's that situation that exists today, and I think more and more people, especially millennials, are not bringing those stereotypes, and they're open to considering factory-built housing because of the innovation that's gone on in factory-built housing over the last 20, 25 years, 30 years.
Oh, that's amazing that, I didn't think of the, driving the car off the lot loses its value, and then you got to climb back from that. That's an interesting fallacy, I guess you would say, about
Yep.
it. And, it almost seems like it's a marketing issue, right? If I was running head of marketing, right, I would I would show, manufactured home driving down the freeway, speedometer reaching 80 miles an hour, and the thing looks great. I'd show a stick-built house on the bed of a thing going down the freeway just falling apart. That I think that's a no-brainer on my part.
Yeah.
It's so cool to think of that.
Yeah. It's when you go into a factory, and anyone that has an opportunity to tour a manufactured home factory plant where they build the houses, you will be very quickly converted to an advocate for manufactured housing because of the way it's built, because of the reinforcement, because of the structural integrity of manufactured housing that you would see in the construction process that is not a part of the construction process in site-built housing. It converts you right away. So if you get that opportunity, take advantage of it.
No, that's all. Now my brain's all cooked on trying to think of marketing ideas. But you mentioned a couple times, changing the subject here a little bit. You mentioned a couple times you've used the words exclusionary housing. And we've talked about it a little bit on the podcast in various different segments. And I've learned a lot but I'm really curious, how exclusionary housing, plays a role, and what the relationship between manufactured housing and exclusionary housing. How does that? How do you see it from your lens?
Yeah, a term that we hear all the time is NIMBYism, and not in my backyard. And this has a lot to do with exclusionary zoning. And in some municipalities, they have just summarily eliminate HUD code housing from any of their housing stock from this point forward. And what I mean by that is they've regulated out any consideration of manufactured housing because of the stigma and stereotype of the older communities, parks, and those type of things that have been in our society since after World War II. So the exclusionary zoning, it comes in that R1, R2 sector of zoning, and in many cases, manufactured HUD code homes have been summarily, excuse me, zoned out. However, in some states and in some municipalities, more than are outlawing manufactured housing, they are including manufactured housing. And as a result, home buyers in those municipalities, in those regions, in those areas are having more options for new construction than ever before. So because of the housing crisis, we're seeing greater interest from municipalities. We're seeing much more interest from developers. And I think over the next 10 years, we will see an increased number of homes under 2,000 square feet, targeting that missing middle and even 80% AMI for home ownership, because it is one of the tenets of our American society, that people can own their own home and experience and participate in asset appreciation. So we're starting to see some changes. That exclusionary zoning is not as prevalent as it used to be, just as recently as 5 years ago. Many case studies looking at how exclusionary zoning didn't allow for workforce housing in that missing middle. So as a result, companies weren't relocating to those municipalities. And as a result, the opportunity for growth, economic growth, population growth, tax-based growth for a municipality have been minimized or eliminated. So there's the reality that sets in once the exclusionary zoning is understood for what it prevents from happening, and more states and municipalities are looking at exclusionary zoning and changing their definition of what factory built housing is. And as a result, the home buyer will get more options. And it really comes back, and we've talked about it this entire time, is education, understanding of what the product can deliver, and understanding exactly what your housing goals are in whatever location you're targeting. So it is really, it's that situation that exists today in exclusionary zoning and NIMBYism and everything like that. So it's a challenge. Yes, it will continue to be a challenge, and you have to take it on head on. You can't skirt around it. And once you get the opportunity as the industry, you have to deliver on what you've promised. And that's as important as anything else.
No, I think it's I love learning more about exclusionary housing and in its historical context. I mean, you could look at some of its history and you're just absolutely, it's like shock and awe. Black people cannot live in this subdivision, and it's like, wow, that's, God, that was not that long ago. And today when we talk about exclusionary housing, it's much more, I wouldn't say complicated or evolved, but just kind of understanding that, how it's being used today and how we see it today. Now, if I'm if I want to get more involved and learn more about exclusionary housing, how do I, and I'm down at my planning meetings and I'm listening, sitting in the back listening to what's going on. How do I identify exclusionary housing practices? If I'm listening to our planning commission or I'm watching it from television, how do individuals identify that? Is it just simply, hey, zoning is bad and planning is bad, but how do you differentiate between the two?
Yeah, zoning and planning is not bad. That's how our communities grow and develop and become neighborhoods and have personalities all their own. So I'm not suggesting an anti-zoning situation, an anti-planning situation. Those are all good things when they're open and the conversation is around that neighborhood and what the end goal is and what the associated objectives are for that neighborhood. The real key that I listen for, and others can listen for too, is for manufactured and factory built housing termed in ways it was referred to 50 years ago. And so when a council person or a zoning person talks about trailers or mobile homes, you know immediately that they have a misunderstanding of today's manufactured housing. So if the council is considering zoning or zoning is considering rezoning a certain area of the municipality, or the municipality is talking about exclusionary zoning of no HUD code mobile homes, when they say mobile or trailers, that's an instant key or an instant tip off that they have a misconception of, or a preconception of, what manufactured housing is today. And that's when gosh, I've got to get in there. I've got to do some education on what today's manufactured housing is. And the way to do that in many cases is show them pictures of a home like the ones behind me and say, would this be allowed in this neighborhood? And when they say yes, you say, that's a manufactured HUD code home.
Yep.
And many times they'll sit back and take a sigh and say, that can't be a manufactured home. That can't be a mobile home. That can't be a trailer.
They're disconnected. They don't understand.
Absolutely. So education is a key part of that. Once you educate them, once you see them, if you get an opportunity to take municipal leaders through a factory or to a model home and show them today's manufactured housing and what's possible, it changes everything. So educate. I keep going back to the same thing. Education is key. Education is the key on fighting NIMBYism, exclusionary zoning, and other things. And municipal leaders that are still using terms in their zoning like mobile homes and trailers don't understand today's manufactured homes and need to learn or be open to learning what today's factory-built housing is really all about.
No, it's great. When I think about things getting in the way today, and I think if a lot of our listeners who are on here, we took a poll, they'd say, hey, interest rates, inflation's out of control, interest rates are massively high, energy cost, affordability is just a lot of stacking up against that, and probably going to continue to get worse until we see some sort of change. Although interest rate cuts, there's a lot of talk right now about that. And
Yep.
How much of a role are interest rates playing today in affordability and just housing availability in general?
Interest rates are key because it relates to payment. And in many cases, that missing middle, that 80 to 120% AMI, are payment buyers more than they are price buyers. So if that final monthly payment is affordable and is less than I'm paying for rent, then it raises the consideration of factory built housing upwards. So don't get me wrong, overall price to the home buyer is critical because it's the base number that term and interest rates are applied to get a payment.
Mm-hmm.
But truly, the end is my payment less than the rental payment, and the fact that I get to participate in any appreciation in my own home is also key as a part of that conversation. So it's payment, and the interest rate as it affects payment is important, but term also affects payment, and down payment affects payment. Down payment requirements affect payment. So there are a lot of elements in that, but ultimately a buyer is looking at a payment and saying, is that payment affordable with my household income? And is it less than what I am paying in rent? Do I have a down payment significant enough to make buying my own home a reality?
Mm-hmm.
All of those things are put together in that consideration. So interest rate, term, availability, it's all important, but higher interest rate is impacts our perception of housing affordability without really understanding how it impacts our payment. And ultimately, when we talk about payment, it can be more affordable than if we're talking about price alone or interest rates or term. But as interest rates come down, as term extends, those payments will come down as well.
What is the and that makes a lot of sense. It's like, hey, there's, yes, interest rates being high impacts it, but there's also this other 200 other things and levers that could move that also impacts it.
Yeah.
If we saw interest rate, hey, they do a 2-point cut, something crazy drastic, I imagine manufacturedhomes.com is going to get a lot more site visits, and a lot more homes are going to be rolling off the assembly line and getting delivered. Is that?
I think demand would go up,
Okay.
simply because I think the hype on a lower interest rate
Mm-hmm.
suggests to home buyers, regardless of what level they're in, that housing will become more affordable, because that's the association we have in our own minds and have been conditioned to think about. So when we see a rate cut by the Fed or hear about a rate cut by the Fed, we automatically think, oh, that means I might be able to buy a house. Oh, that means my house and ownership is going to be less expensive. So the association is there without really understanding and the necessity of understanding how that rate cut will impact my payment. So it's a positive when the Fed cuts the rate, but how that rate is interpreted in that loan and in the payments of that home buyer is truly not fully understand until the home buyer goes through the application process, secures the right loan, has the right term, and then discovers that the interest rate is XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, that's how that credit cut can and will impact positively the home buyer situation. But the cut itself, when you look at it, that does not necessarily stimulate housing demand, but the perception of affordability with a rate cut does contribute to the concept of affordability and will increase traffic, will certainly increase traffic to home buyer sites like manufacturedhomes.com and modularhomes.com and others to look at the possibilities of today's factor built housing.
It makes complete the psychological factor in there plays a big role.
Yep.
And then making sure that they actually get to the finish line and get those benefits of the low rate additionally does that. And I could see situations where, hey, interest rates are cut, get my psychological benefit, go through the buying process to find out I get down to the finish line and that benefit is not there because of fees or points or hey, I added extra stuff into my deal and like there's more to the story
Yeah,
is what you're saying. So the stars got to align a little bit in that
yeah,
process as well.
yeah.
Well,
And today, there are some situations where rate buy downs. They buy down the rate to a lower rate for that term of that loan, and that's an option today, and it's being used to get that payment into a range that makes sense for the home buyer. And that's a tool available today in a what's perceived as a high rates environment. Although anybody that was back in 1979, 80, 81, 82, 83, when rates were as high as 16, 18%, and people bought their houses at 12%. These rates look very attractive compared to those back in that period.
yeah, the cost of the home too, $20,000 for a home was a lot different than what was it? Twice their annual income,
Yep.
so you think about that, it's like, wow, that's a big difference than, 8 times or 5 times somebody's annual income.
Yeah.
Well, where do you see all this going as we look to the future? You see 5, 10, 20 years out, what kind of role do you see manufactured housing playing?
I think we'll see less and less discussion of how a house is built and how it's sited, and more attention to aesthetics and features and those type of things. Auxiliary dwelling units, for example, that are attached or detached or above the garage. Those type of things will increase housing supply and potentially increase income potential for a homeowner. So I think in the next 30 years, we're going to see increased density. I think we're going to see a lesser and lesser emphasis on the way a home is built and more emphasis on the delivery and the end product and home ownership. So that will be a critical key in the next 20, 30 years. I think you'll see embrace municipalities, developers, builders, and others embrace factory-built housing as it evolves and innovates in the product itself. And I don't see near term. I don't see in the next 10 years that our housing crisis will be over. I think the housing crisis will continue for the next 20 years. And even beyond that, we may be in a permanent housing crisis. And that's a result of a lot of things. And I think that will be the struggle. And housing, and if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, housing, shelter is at the top. If food, shelter, and security is one of the key elements of life. And in one way or another, people will have to find shelter of some sort. And I think there'll be growing consideration of factory-built housing in that model. So it's no longer an option. It will be part of the normal conversation associated with housing development and housing availability. And it will become just another way a home is manufactured. And today, where it's between 8 and 12% of new housing starts, I think somewhere in the future, it could be as high as 20, 30, 35% of housing starts, allowing that 80 to 120% AMI to afford home ownership and experience and participate in that part of the American dream.
Well, that's amazing. Now, last few questions here as we get towards the end of the podcast. We get into what we
Okay.
call the lightning round. I'm just going to fire a couple fun questions off at you, and
Okay.
we'll see where this goes.
All right.
First question. You can snap your fingers. I'll give you one wish to change something about housing. What would it be?
Greater consideration of factory-built housing wherever housing is needed, which is everywhere.
Removing like a zoning exception.
Understand the product, understand the objective, and consider all methods of housing construction to meet those goals.
Love it. Love it. Next question.
Yep.
Have you or would you ever build your own home?
Absolutely. I've built 5 of my own homes. I've assisted or overseen the construction of thousands of other homes. And all the way from SIP panels, panelized homes, all the way to modular and manufactured homes, factory-built components and structures will ultimately play a role in our housing supply situation in this country. Has to.
Great answer. If you could change one thing about financing for manufactured housing, what would it be?
Consider it.
Consider it.
Yep.
Just consider what?
Consider manufactured housing as just another form of housing that will fit into your lending models for traditional site-built housing. And Freddie and Fannie have taken huge steps under duty to serve and demands by FHFA and Congress under duty to serve to include factory-built housing into lending programs and appraisals for those homes that require or allow site-built comps to be used when appraising those homes. So when I say consider it a home, consider it a housing option for your buyers, consider risk, consider all of those things that you would normally consider on evaluating a buyer or an applicant to a loan. And yes, pay attention to the structure, but don't exclude a structure type from your lending programs if that applicant is qualified to own their own home. Consider manufactured and modular housing as a part of that solution and will become mainstream housing in the future.
Get rid of the manufactured home appraisal form.
It's a house.
Yeah.
It's a house.
Yeah. Love it. Absolutely love it. Now this absolutely great stuff here. If people wanted to get in touch with you and learn more about and just reach out, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Well, contact me through manufacturedhomes.com or modularhomes.com. We have a whole group, a library of videos and educational materials about factory-built housing development and that type of thing. Go to manufacturedhomes.com, modularhomes.com, click on info, send an email asking me questions if you want. You can also email me directly at chris@manufacturedhomes.com, and I'll be happy to engage in conversation with you.
That's an easy email address to remember there. Well, Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast today. Look forward to having you again in the future. And thank you so much for being on.
I had a lot of fun. Thanks, Sean.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Take care.
This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace independent professional judgment. Land Gorilla Inc. makes no representations, warranties, or promises for and disclaims any express or implied warranties related to content. Before acting on any information, you should consider the appropriateness of the information as it pertains to your unique business needs.